Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Coffee with Craig, where we talk about all things firearms, firearms policy, politics, culture, media, you name it. We're talking about it right here on Coffee with Craig. So please take a moment to like and share this program and let your friends know where you're hanging out at about this time. Also, if you haven't already done so, please subscribe to our YouTube channel, follow us on Facebook, and make sure if you're following us on Facebook to hit the notification button so you can get the alerts as soon as we go live. Also, want to encourage you, visit fpcgear.com, fpcgear.com. All sorts of Pro 2A swag, T-shirts, coffee mugs, hoodies, you name it, all different stuff to show your support for the Second Amendment. Because you won't just be showing your support outwardly, you'll actually be supporting it because, well, every dollar that you spend there goes right back into the fight for our right to keep and bear arms. So you can support the Second Amendment and you can look good doing it. All right, so... You know, there's much that's made, especially in the election of 2016. There was much that was made when it came to going after the pro-gun vote or the pro-2A vote. Republicans in particular, President Trump and other Republicans, focused on making it a point to let gun owners know that the Republican Party supports the Second Amendment. I mean, how many times? I mean, if you guys ever go to any political rally where they're talking about stuff, the first thing that they'll say is, well, for the Republicans say, well, I support the Second Amendment. What's funny is that you'll even get some Democrats who say, well, I support the Second Amendment. The problem is that it's one thing to say that you support the Second Amendment, meaning you generally support the idea that people are allowed to own guns, is what they perceive it as. But the thing is, the support for the Second Amendment, believer in being pro-gun, is a very, very different thing. Oftentimes, we find that these very same Republicans, they're not vocal on Second Amendment issues, right? They're not only are they generally not vocal, but there are many, many times when it comes to the actual implementation of those issues that they actually take positions that are against the Second Amendment and actually infringe on our fundamental right to keep and bear arms. And they seem to think that, the worst part is in dealing with some of these policymakers, they seem to think that, well, this is what I get from consultants. Well, my candidate or my guy is better than a Democrat would be on the issue. And they seem to think that somehow that makes it okay. And there's tons of different ways where these folks have decided that they are, in fact, going to infringe upon our rights. Probably one of the biggest examples has to do with our current president, Mr. Trump. Now, we may agree with Mr. Trump on a lot of things, but there are some things, well, let's just be honest, we take issue with. Just take, for example, his position on bump stocks. In other words, not only is he in favor of the idea of banning bump stocks, but he wants to go even further. He actually wants to ignore the Constitution and the separation of powers in order to rewrite regulations, in order to redefine something that is defined in law. It's defined in statute, in law. He wants to violate the Constitution and separation of powers in order to ban a firearm part. That's how far the president is willing to go. And then there's his whole position on red flag laws. The idea of, as he said, he supports the idea of taking the guns first and due process later. In other words, Constitution really doesn't mean anything. We don't really need to worry about that whole, due process before you lose your rights. No. We're going to take your due process rights now. We're going to take them now. And then you can later go to court, innocent or guilty until proven innocent. You can now spend tens of thousands of dollars on an attorney, on psychiatrists in order to prove that you are not a danger to yourself or others. That's our president. That's the person that the NRA came out early and endorsed. That's the one that gun owners spent tons of money to support in order to help him to get into the White House. Despite the fact that many of us disagreed with him on other stuff, Despite the fact that many were concerned that he wouldn't govern according to Republican values, they still got behind him and supported him. And now, what have we really gotten to show for it? We haven't gotten concealed carry reciprocity. We haven't gotten the elimination of gun-free zones. We have gotten 2 Supreme Court justices who, by the way, we still haven't seen a case. We've got one case finally that's going to be heard by the Supreme Court. Be interesting to see how that case turns out. But once again, we really haven't seen a whole lot of bang for our buck when it comes to President Trump. But see, he's not the only Republican. I want to be real clear. This is not a Trump bashing thing. He's not the only one. Senator Marco Rubio. Now, this was a guy who originally, when he first burst onto this national scene, I actually liked him because what I liked about him was I felt like he could communicate as a Republican our party's values in a way that non-Republicans could resonate with. That could resonate with non-Republicans. He's a very good communicator. The problem is that when it came to the values, once again, it's one thing to communicate the values. It's another thing to ignore the values. In his case, having to do with the red flag laws. The idea that you due process, no, you don't get due process. Due process, bad, right? We're not going to concern you with due process. Because once again, we're talking about red flag laws. We're talking about ex parte hearings, right? We're talking about hearings where you don't get to be there. You don't get a chance to face your accuser, right? When you do finally get there, when you do finally get to go before a judge, once again, you're guilty until proven innocent. You have to prove that you are not a danger to yourself or others. The very fact that someone who, and Marco Rubio is not an idiot by any stretch of the imagination, but the very fact that he doesn't get it, here's the thing. It's not, and I don't even know it's not that he doesn't get it. It's the fact that he just sees it as, well, okay, so you're not going to have your guns for a few weeks. That's all it is. And he doesn't get that it is a fundamental infringement on a constitutional right. The constitutional right that is our legal foundation, how we express our fundamental human right for self-defense. Now, he's made some right statements on the Second, but here's one where, once again, I'm sorry, maybe this is a public policy thing where they feel like it's a matter of, well, but it's a compromise. You know, you're giving up a little liberty in order to get security. Well, we all know that doesn't happen. We all know that when you give up liberty in order to obtain security, first of all, the government will seek to take more liberty. And more liberty, and more liberty. And they'll continue to offer up the idea that you're going to get more security. But in the end, you really don't. You don't get more security. You just lose more liberty. And the very fact that they just see it as a gun issue and not a constitutional rights issue, as a civil rights issue, that is part of the problem. And that's, once again, part of the problem with Mr. Rubio. Now, he's not the only one. I can tell you here in California, we've had more than our fair share of issues with some of these folks. Folks like my good friend here, Miss Ling Ling Chang. Now, Ling Ling Chang was a state assembly member who actually voted to ban semi-automatic handguns, semi-automatic rifles in the state of California. She voted to ban them, right? And I don't believe that she personally believed that was a bad issue, but here was the thing. She was listening to a political consultant, a Republican political consultant who told her, well, you know, this is where your district is at on guns. And maybe, you know, I realize you can vote good on these gun bills over here, but if you vote to ban these guns over here, well, then you can go back to your constituents and you can say, hey, look what I did. But here's the problem, and this is the thing that folks like Ling Ling Chang just don't get. And that's that, first of all, anti-gun voters are generally not single-issue voters. They're not going to vote against you because you are pro-gun. In most cases, we're talking about liberal Democrats who, quite frankly, if they don't like your position, if you're a Republican and they don't like your position on guns, they're going to find another reason not to vote for you. It could be your position on abortion. It could be your issue on taxes, your position on unions, your position on the environment. They're going to find a reason to vote against you, if for no other reason than the fact that you have an R after your name. That is how anti-gun voters vote. They're not single-issue voters. But pro-gun voters tend to be very single-issue. In fact, I know many independents, many libertarians, many conservatives, and even some liberals for whom the Second Amendment, your position on gun rights, is vitally important. And they will vote for you based on where you stand on the Second Amendment. Because they see it, they're like, look, you protect my right to protect myself, and I've got the rest. I'll take care of the rest of my rights. But that's what they failed to get. Now, Ling Ling has returned to the California State Legislature as a state senator, and I'm hoping that she has learned a very valuable lesson, in particular in some of these swing districts. And that's where you tend to find the Republicans who tend to waffle on our issues. They tend to be in swing districts. But here's the thing, let me tell you. During that same year, there were a total of 4 Republicans who voted anti-gun. All 4 of them would eventually get voted out of the California State Legislature. Only one has made it back in. At the same time, there were 6 Democrats who voted good on gun issues. During that very same time, guess what? All 6 got reelected and have been reelected again. So that ought to tell you something. That really should tell you something. That ought to tell you that maybe voting anti-gun, even if it's only 1 or 2 areas. And by the way, let me just say, all of these Republicans that I'm talking to have not been completely anti-gun, right? They've got a few areas here and there where they've done they've supported the right positions. And they expect us to be okay with the fact that, well, hey, I messed up on this. They don't want to admit that they messed up on that one. And we got one case here. Well, we have certain Republican legislators who believe that, well, it's okay to give, for example, law enforcement special rights. Like, we're going to allow law enforcement to be able to carry a firearm or have access to magazines that the average everyday citizen can't. Even worse, we're going to allow retired law enforcement to have access to firearms and magazines and things that law-abiding citizens can't. Now, mind you, some of you may already know the answer to this question, but I'll just ask you. What's the difference between an average citizen and a retired law enforcement officer when it comes to arrest powers? What's the difference in their ability to enforce the law? You know what the difference is? Bupkis. They don't have any. When you're retired from law enforcement, when you no longer work for your law enforcement agency, you don't have a special right or a special ability to enforce the law. But what you do in many cases, and we've seen this here in the state of California, you do have special rights. In other words, you can now possess certain things, certain firearms, certain magazines that other law-abiding citizens with no police powers who don't work for law enforcement don't get. So what we wind up doing is we wind up elevating one group of citizens over non-law enforcement citizens over another group of non-law enforcement. And when I say non-law enforcement, I'm not talking about the fact that you never served. And we very much appreciate law enforcement. I'm not talking about the fact that you never served in law enforcement. I'm talking about that's not your job anymore. That's not their job anymore. Therefore, they don't have a special need to have access to these things. So then why should they have special rights? And see, the reason why, here's the reason why this is so important. Because oftentimes what these anti-gun legislators do is they know that they're going to have a hard time getting some of these measures passed if law enforcement unions oppose them. So here's what they do. They offer a compromise. Tell you what, Mr. Police Officer Union or Mr. Corrections Officers Union, we'll exempt your members out of the bill even when they're retired if you'll remove your opposition to the bill. And they jump on it almost every single time. In other words, the unions that represent law enforcement officers. Then, by the way, we know study after study show, the poll after poll is done. The average law enforcement officer on the ground believes in an individual right to keep and bear arms for citizens. They do. They fundamentally do. But the leadership, the union leadership of these organizations say, well, hey, I'm getting this from my members, so screw their wives or their children or their brothers and sisters or aunts and uncles or moms or dads. Forget them. I got this exemption for my member. And they think they got something done. So it's like, okay, you give me my thing, and then I'll leave you alone. So that's one thing to learn. And then there are just some folks who, quite frankly, in my opinion, are completely and utterly clueless. And the worst part about some of these folks is that how shall we say, the more you confront them and try to be reasonable with them, the worse in fact they get. This is Mr. Brian Boquist. He was a state senator in the state of Oregon. He was the lone Republican who supported their red flag gun confiscation law. And that's, by the way, that's what they are. These red flag laws, they're not about mental health because they have nothing to do with mental health. Nowhere or anywhere in the process of any of these policies do you see someone getting mental health, being evaluated by a mental health professional. Nowhere in the process does that ever happen. So it's not about mental health, right? It's all about gun confiscation. It's all about taking their rights and then taking their property, which happens to be guns. Mr. Boquist, this individual in particular, who, I just put it this way. The only way sometimes you can get the attention of some of these folks is when you call them out, is when you demonstrate in public just exactly where they are and what their policies actually have, what the actual practical implication of their policies are. In this particular case, pushing red flag laws, this individual, we all know who's the biggest proponent, the guy who's pushing these red flag laws, and that's Michael Bloomberg. And the worst part is that when you get Republicans like Mr. Boquist, who are willing to sit down and basically be used like a sock puppet by some of these folks, by folks like Michael Bloomberg. Once again, normally solid anti-gun folks. But when you decide that you're going to work against the better interest of your constituents, when you're going to allow your feelings, and that's what a lot of this is. A lot of this is feelings to get in the way of the hard facts of what the Constitution says about due process, about what the Constitution says about private property and the right to keep and bear arms, then you wind up going awry. He was the lone Republican that supported that idea. And this is another thing sometimes you have to worry about. You have to worry about Republicans who for some reason think that just because they are a Republican, because they have an R after their name, and they come up with an idea that it's pro-gun. And even when their idea is wrong and bad, well, you should still get behind it. Senator John Morlock, he's a senator here in the state of California. Normally a solid libertarian, conservative-leaning former accountant, normally a pretty solid vote on the Second Amendment, decided he was going to introduce a bill that dealt with Antifa. He was like, this is my anti-Antifa bill. Right? I'm tired of seeing them attacking conservatives or attacking Trump supporters. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to ban your ability to take certain things to rallies and protests. You're not going to be able to take signs with posts that are of a certain size. You're not going to be able to take water bottles, no knives, no guns. No guns. Now, on the surface, sounds like a great idea. Sounds like a good idea by people who are ignorant. Oh yeah, no, we don't want guns at rallies or protests. But here's the problem: you have a fundamental right to keep and bear arms. So if you have a concealed carry permit in this particular case, if you have a concealed carry permit in the state of California, why should you not be able to have a firearm? Well, their argument, on college campus, no. you already can't carry a firearm even with the concealed carry permit on a college campus. So this isn't about college campuses. You didn't restrict your bill to just college campuses. The worst part about this was that as soon as the bill came out, we reached out to the author's office. And we told them, we said, hey, in general, we don't like the bill. We don't like the bill. We're not going to be supporters. But we're going to have to ferociously oppose it unless you put an exemption in for concealed carry permit holders. They didn't do it. They didn't say they would do it. They decided they're not going to amend the bill. The bill came up in committee. We showed up. We testified against it. And then the author decided to say, well, when we reached out to the Firearms Policy Coalition, no, they didn't reach out before they introduced it. They didn't reach out after. We reached out to them. And we were the ones who followed up when they decided that they were not going to amend the bill, right? But they said we offered no amendments, and we clearly had offered amendments, right? Once again, here's a guy who's now scared because he doesn't want to seem like, well, we're not anti-gun. I have no problem with concealed carry. Then, okay, commit to amend your bill. Right there in committee, commit to amend your bill to provide an exemption for concealed carry permit holders. Did that happen? No. The bill got out of committee. And guess how many Republicans voted for it? None. Not one. If it weren't for the votes of anti-gun Democrats, every single one that voted for his bill was anti-gun. And then he decided to get mad at us because we pointed out his bill was anti-gun. And we let our people know, because that's what we do. We're not Republican or Democrat. We say, look, if you are pro-gun, if you claim to be pro-gun, and then you author an anti-gun bill, and it gets out of committee supported only by anti-gun Democrats, we're going to let our folk know. Because obviously you're proud of it. That's what happened. So we decided to have an op-ed penned by a conservative writer, attacking us. But the problem was there was a fundamental problem with this bill. And the fundamental problem with this bill was, quite frankly, it was anti-gun. It was clearly, it was once again, the worst part about this, once again, is he doesn't even realize that he's doing their work out of his ignorance, right? His bill would have disarmed law-abiding people at protests, demonstrations, and leaving you defenseless against Antifa and other criminal groups. Because guess what? Here's the thing that folks really don't. Here's the thing that just like the anti-gun folks really don't get. Here's the thing, quite frankly, that they don't. Sorry about that. Here's the thing, quite frankly, that they just don't get, is that the Antifa crowd, the lawbreakers, they're going to show up anyway. And if they're going to bring a gun, they're going to bring a gun anyway. They're not going to pay attention to the law, because everything that they did with every single item that they brought, those acts were all illegal. The assault and the battery that they imposed on people was already illegal. And yet still, in this particular case, they felt it necessary. They felt it necessary to try and go after the rights of law-abiding citizens. Because, see, all that's going to happen is just like what happens with every other firearm ban or anything like that. What's going to wind up happening is this, is that the law-abiding citizens will leave their stuff at home, and the criminals, the Antifas of the world, they're still going to show up with their stuff, including their illegally carried concealed weapon, so that they can, basically leaving law-abiding citizens vulnerable to attack. So anyway, all of this is to say make this very basic point. There's some things that some of our Republican friends really need to come to understand, including Mr. Trump. And I hope he will listen to us. These are the things. This is where you get it wrong. Number one, Republicans. The Second Amendment is not about hunting. It's not even exactly about self-defense. It's not even about guns. Here's what it's about. It's about the fundamental human right to be able to defend yourself from all enemies, foreign and domestic, up to and including a tyrannical government. Now, when you do that, you take a fundamental understanding. Number one, you start dealing with the issue of a fundamental human right and protecting the importance of protecting that fundamental human right. You also understand that it is a civil right. And we know that if you're going to infringe upon a fundamental human right or a civil right, that the bar is much, much higher than simply infringing on a privilege, right? Understand that these rights, the fundamental human rights, they're not given to us by government. Government exists to protect those rights, but they don't come from government, including you, Mr. and Mrs. Republican legislator or elected official. You don't give us those rights. Therefore, you cannot take them away. But you have a duty, a constitutional duty, to protect those rights. And when you swear your oath of office, you swear to protect those rights. And if you're not going to stand up, and speak out, that's the other thing. If you're not going to speak out, if you're just going to sit around when our rights are being infringed upon, then ladies and gentlemen, you are no better. You're absolutely positively no better than the anti-gun Democrat. You are no better. Matter of fact, you're worse. You're worse because you know better. You know you need to say something. You know those rights are under attack. You claim to support them, but you're not willing to stand up and do something. It's like telling your wife that you love her and then never doing anything to show her that you love her. Ooh, ouch. Well, that's where gun owners feel. That's how gun owners feel when it comes to the many in the Republican Party. And it seems like more and more as they're introducing these red flag laws, as they're more and more willing to ignore the Constitution and ban firearm parts like bump stocks. More and more we're starting to recognize you anti-gun Republicans as exactly what you are, and that is anti-gun. And if you think that the firearms community, the firearms supporting community is going to continue to be behind you as you seek to violate our rights, you've got another thing coming. Anyway. All right, folks. Well, hey, that's going to be it for today's Coffee with Craig. We very much appreciate you guys tuning in. We appreciate you liking and sharing this program, telling your friends about the Firearms Policy Coalition. We are the home in the fight for civil rights. Got to use them or you're going to lose them. You guys take care.
If you like our videos, follow, subscribe, like, and share.